I wanted to ask you broadly about yesterday in manifestos, and then to Collin College, as we're trying to connect those dots with those flyers from 2017. So can you tell me about your take on this concept of there being a manifesto yesterday in El Paso? How do you hear that news?
I mean, he wrote 4 pages. I don't know. There's been some discussion about whether it should be called a manifesto or an essay or a screed or whatever you want to call it. But he definitely has an ideology and had opinions about political matters. Wrote those down in an intentional way. So, assuming this document does belong to him, you could call that a manifesto. I heard the law enforcement today calling it a manifesto too. So, I think there's been some about that. Maybe that's not the most important part of the story.
What outside of the fatalities and the deaths, what is the more important part of the story in terms of the radicalization or the hate that you see?
Yeah, it looks like this manifesto is very anti-immigrant. It also has an interesting thread that I haven't seen in other similar manifestos. So this idea about automation. So he mentioned 5 times in the manifesto that he was annoyed about jobs being automated away. He also had a bit on his own LinkedIn page about feeling like he didn't have any skills, things like that. So I don't know if there's if that's a grievance that I haven't seen that particular grievance expressed before. So, but it definitely could play into why he chose this particular population, Hispanic population, to be angry about, because he could have constructed a narrative or had one constructed for him that these folks were taking jobs and that kind of thing. So,
can you I know automation and immigration are sort of 2 sides of the same coin when it comes to grievances, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, if he's angry at a population and is using this automation idea, which has been in the news a bit. There's a presidential candidate that talks a lot about automation and universal basic income and that sort of thing. Both of those concepts made it into this manifesto. And so, yes, he may have constructed an argument in his mind that this was the cause of his, whatever issues he had with the world, and then picked a population to blame that on. So, yeah, it could very well end up being that that this was his main grievance.
So for people who don't know they're just never heard of a manifesto before, or just at the real basic layperson level, what does it mean that this person posted their grievances into this environment?
Well, there's 2 audiences. One is their own self. I mean, usually they're trying to get their argument straight about why they did this, right? And the other audience, of course, is other people like him. Since the Christchurch shooter, they've been using these manifestos. The last 2 shooters seem to be using the manifestos to inspire others. So they're deliberately referencing each other in the manifestos and so on. I think that flies in the face a little bit of the advice that folks are getting to not talk about it. That's probably still good advice for a lot of reasons, but it's also true that these guys definitely have copies of each other's work and are definitely talking about each other's work and using each other's names and stuff. So none of that whole, no notoriety movement and all of that, none of that is having any effect on these guys at all.
Well, so there are sites out there where people who do these things post their manifestos or their beliefs. And so I'm just at a real simple level. Can you talk about what is this ecosystem out there where people can put these hateful things?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the sites are the same ones that you and I use, regular social media sites, but increasingly people are the extremist viewpoints being shut out of those services. So they're going to the darker and darker corners of the web. So the services where I'm seeing a lot of activity now are the Chans, the image board sites, 4chan, 8chan, that kind of thing. Those have been active in this space for a long time, but it's getting to be one of the more popular places. Also, there's a lot of activity on messaging service called Telegram, some other places. So, yeah, there's there's quite an ecosystem of sites where these guys can go and discuss with other people, post anonymously. They talk back and forth about how they feel about the last shooter, if that person did a good job or not, how they feel about the manifesto, what do they think about the arguments that were made. And so they have pretty long and detailed discussions about this stuff. They this may be too much detail for your audience, but they canonized them as saints. They refer to the kill levels and the numbers of people that were murdered and stuff. I mean, it's very dark. This is not Facebook memes, you know. The stuff that they're talking about is very very dark.
And so the use of can you describe how popular social media and also sort of just darker web social media is playing a role in what we're seeing?
Well, I mean, this is the place where if these guys want to go and discuss, this is where they can go. They usually don't have an in-person network. They might have a small one. They might have one or two friends, but they're really getting a lot of their feedback online. And usually in these kind of anonymous, very nebulous places. So, yeah, it's definitely an important place for them. These rooms, chat rooms, website, whatever you want to call them, there's different types, but they definitely pick and choose where they want to be. Sometimes they'll try to make friends. You'll see them picking a handle for themselves, so a name, and then they'll reuse that across different sites to try to retain their brand. But they can also disappear, so they can decide that they want to change their brand, you know, and come up with a completely new identity. So you're and so if you could just describe briefly, you track this at a real data level. It's not like you're in these rooms looking around. It's like you're gathering a huge amount of information. Yeah, so I'm a data scientist, and I gather massive amounts of data about how these types of communities work, trying to understand what are the patterns, what are they doing, how are they working with each other, what are their beliefs, things like that. Are they growing, are they shrinking? And so, for example, you're talking about the sort of darker websites. So some of the questions that I might answer as a researcher would be, how do they retain their brand under duress? So if they're being kicked off of a site and they move to another one, how do they signal to each other that they're the same person they used to know? How does that process work? And then what's the data that I need to prove that that's happening? So that's just an example. But yeah, I study all the dark places, and you try to use massive amounts of data to do that.
So you are interestingly now connecting a dot between something that happened at Collin College in 2017 and what happened in El Paso. How do you do that?
Well, I don't know if there's a connection. There's a connection there. I don't know how serious it is, but I kept a campus flyering map for a long time, so I was concerned about the amount of propaganda that was being distributed on campuses by groups and individuals in these extremist movements. So 2017, I started making a Google map of campus flyering incidents, and then I did that again in 2018. And I would manually enter these. So I would, find the propaganda, enter it, find the propaganda, enter it. And I thought, when I heard that he went to Collin College, I thought, oh, I've heard that before. So I went back, and indeed it was in my 2017 map that this campus had been hit, but I didn't realize they'd also been hit with propaganda from two other groups later, and I didn't have those incidents down for whatever reason. So the propaganda had definitely been displayed at the school. I have no knowledge of whether this person saw it or anything like that. But I do know that when propaganda is distributed at a school, a university environment, it's very disruptive to the students. They're very upset. Usually, that's one of the reasons actually that I started tracking this stuff, was because I was interested in what the administrators' responses were at the different schools and how they handled this, because it is kind of like a crisis on campus when this happens. It's very upsetting, very disruptive. And so I find it hard to believe that if his campus got hit 3 or 4 times by at least 2 different groups in a span of 2 years while he was a student there, supposedly, that he wouldn't have known about it or had some kind of interaction there. But again, there's no way to know that with the information that we have. So
you're saying at the very least he would have been aware of it.
I mean, probably. Again, I don't know how big the school is or how engaged the students are, but at most schools, having this kind of activity happen there is extremely disruptive. And there's, it's in the campus paper, there's administrator, responses and healing groups and this kind of thing. So the students get very upset about it. So I would imagine that that something like that happened there, but again, I don't know for sure.
Two follow-ups on that. You're saying you're interested in how they respond. How did Collin College respond, in your view, to this?
So that's an interesting point. When I was looking through the news stories about it last night, I couldn't find any responses from the college about it. So it may be that they just didn't make it into the news cycle, or they've already cycled out and aren't findable anymore. I don't have a response from the college in my notes, and I couldn't find one online, so I don't know.
What would be the appropriate response be from a college?
Yeah, so the better incidents are managed with immediate denunciation of what happened, unequivocal. This is terrible. This is not what our community stands for. This goes against our values. That kind of thing. Support for the students. Just very firm renouncing of this kind of activity. The less successful responses are when there's some kind of equivocation or a both sides narrative, and that thankfully is happening less and less the more propaganda is distributed, and unfortunately it is kind of going up. So the colleges are getting better at responding.
The both sides narrative meaning, hey, this is free speech and people can say what they need to say on this college campus?
And that may be true, or you may believe, the administrator may believe that for whatever reason, but that isn't the message that needs to be conveyed in an incident like this. It just doesn't work. It makes the incident last longer. The students get more upset. The parents get upset. The news media keeps it, in the cycle, which is exactly what the groups want when they do this. I have a document that was actually called a postering guide from Patriot Front, one of the groups that does this flyering most often. They're still doing it. And they hit Collin College also with propaganda. But the postering guide says we have two goals. The first goal is to, if there's any students that are sympathetic, of course, try to recruit them. But the second goal is for news media coverage. So they really do recognize that. There's also a third goal, which wasn't mentioned in the postering guide, but they use this propaganda posting as a rite of passage into the group. So you have to do a certain number of flyering incidents before you can go to the next level.
Wow. So if there are thousands of colleges in the United States, why would they be interested in Collin College?
Yeah, I don't think it's intentional. Like I said, again, it's more of a scattershot approach. They'll specifically tell each other, don't hit the same college multiple times, hit more colleges. So they'll go to even like tiny places. I've seen flyers posted at, culinary schools and stuff. It's more like a shots on goal approach.
Volume.
Definitely. And they don't need to, that doesn't mean that there's a student there that is the one that posted it. So some of the advice that's given in that postering guide, for example, talked about, how to evade detection if you're not even of a student age. So they aren't necessarily students there at all. That's one of the big assumptions that people make, is that it's their own students doing it, and that's not necessarily true.
Are the flyers effective in radicalizing?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Are the flyers effective as a tool for recruitment and radicalization?
So that's unknown. I don't have any data on that, on whether people get, actually convinced by it. I do have a lot of data showing that it's very upsetting to the students who aren't receptive to that message. So at the very least, it's sort of a terror approach. I think they might like to think that it's recruiting, effective at recruiting, but I don't have any data to say that that's the case.
So if this shooter was at Collin College at the time of those flyers, would you at least suspect he was aware that they were there and or maybe involved in it?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I could say one way or the other on that. Like I said, I don't even know how big the school is or how engaged the student body is. I know some residential colleges that are more tight-knit, an incident like this would be extremely hard to ignore. But again, I don't know how politically aware the students are there, or I don't even know if he was a full-time or part-time student, if he was working all day and going to night classes. I have no idea. But I would say that at a lot of schools, don't know about this one in particular, but at a lot of schools, this kind of activity is enormously disruptive, and there's really no way you could not know about it.
So last on the question on that point, what would you do now if you were here and you were investigating this? What more information do we need to connect these dots?
I might talk to the school, see if they remember it. Usually the administrators that were involved in something like this will remember. The student paper will also usually run a story on it. They will remember interviewing folks that found the signs. Usually they get taken down pretty quick but preserved, and then someone gets a picture of it, that kind of thing. So I'd get more information on like where they were, what time of year, what was the mood. Did the campus police ever track it down, or did they not worry about it? It's just like, how did all of that shake out? Because it was not covered in the news that I could find. They mostly mentioned Colin as in a list of other places that had been,
So we need to dig in on that and see how they responded.
I think so. Yeah. I think it's worth asking. Usually, like I said, these incidents are pretty disruptive to the campus, so the administrators would probably remember it happening and what their response was. And not to say that it's him. I mean, that would be extremely unlikely, I think, just statistically. But to see what was the mood on campus around that incident, and maybe that's illustrative of what could be in his mind, or I don't know.
Just a few more questions. How rare is it to have a shooter inventory their whole arsenal in their manifesto or whatever they're posting online? Like this is the weapons I have.
So one of the reasons that I think he might have done that was because the prior Christchurch-inspired shooter, the Poway synagogue shooter, it's kind of believed online in these types of groups that he did a kind of a rush job. And so I think this shooter was trying to convey to his peers that he had thought this through. So when he mentions the things about, I'm choosing this gun, but maybe it's not the very best one, but it's what I have, and I'm going to wear this kind of glove. And I don't know if he actually ended up wearing that, but I think he was trying to convey to his, friends or whatever, just the people that he was trying to inspire, that he had thought this through. But I don't know what he was really, that's just my guess.
Last question. So it says that the reports are that this manifesto was taken down immediately or very quickly. Does that mean it's gone, or are there people out there in this universe who can still see it?
No, and it wasn't even taken down. Like there was a copy going around on Drudge Report like this morning. So I think no, it's definitely not gone. There's multiple versions of it on Telegram. I found it in both PDF format. I found images of it, plain text, websites for it. Yeah, it's not gone.
So
I think it's just gone from popular places, but it's not gone from the places where these guys are.
Understood. And how can policymakers crack down on this kind of speech while not trampling on free speech?
That is the $1 million question, and it's way above my pay grade. When we find out, I will be so happy. Yeah, I have no idea. This is a serious problem. It involves transparency on the social media side. It involves, prevention, content moderation, technology itself, computer science. I mean, anthropology. All of this will be involved. It's this very hard question. And I'm sorry, I can't give you a better, more hopeful, decisive answer. But it's going to be very, very difficult.
Do you feel like dealing with this hate speech is going to be necessary in order to reduce the level of violence that we're seeing?
Yes.
Why?
We're going to have to do something because they're inspiring each other. So, and you can see that in their own words. Then those are just the ones we know about. So yes, they're inspiring each other. They're creating this narrative where they're actually it's sort of like valorizing one another. And I don't see that naturally going away with the environment that we have right now. So.
Thank you very much for your time and your research, and we appreciate it.
There's a flyer on my phone.
Oh, a flyer from Collin College?
A flyer, I'm not sure if it's the same one.
Okay, let me see it if I can.
Yeah, I'll try to show it to you here.
There you go.
This is ready. I don't know if you can see that at all.
Ready for a draft? Is that what that says?
Yeah.
It's
What's the? I can't read the
Want me to-
affiliation down at the bottom. Can you tell
It says, ready for a draft. Corporate America needs you to send you halfway around the world so you can give your life to make the rich Judeo-capitalists even richer. 3% of Americans control 85% of the country's wealth. Do not let the greed of these people draft our white working class youth into a war under the false pretense of defending America. It says an ANP info pack is available for $5 donation. ANP, Westland, Michigan.
It's probably the
American
it might be
Nazi
the
Party.
Nazi Party, yeah. Okay, I was going to say it's either, yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen that particular flyer before, but that's a pretty common message. It's using an anti-war position to try to make this sort of white working class is under oppression kind of argument. Yeah, that's pretty standard stuff from them.
And Alan, where did is this the one that was at Collin College?
This is the one that came from the Plano High School. A parent there said that he was one of the ones handing this out and recruiting kids when he was his senior year in high school.
Oh, so did you hear that? So a parent at Plano High School said this boy was handing these out while in high school, and then went to Collin College after that.
Yeah, that's very sad. High school is a little bit more rare to have an incident like this happen, although we have seen it. Usually it's outsiders, though. It's not the students themselves. So, for example, the Ku Klux Klan will flyer at a school, they'll put stuff on the kids' cars out in the parking lot, or that sort of thing. It's a little bit more unusual to have the high school student doing it themselves, but it's not unheard of.
So this may be getting out of your range of expertise here, but if you have a kid in high school who's done this, would that put them on some kind of radar screen, or like, you know, and then if you are of some sort of agent, it'd be fairly easy to connect the dots. Oh, now they're at Collin College and these things are happening. Like, we're interested in this kid.
Yeah, I don't have any information about that other than being the parent of teenagers. Yeah, I don't know how each school would handle that or whatever. But I mean, looking back, hindsight is always 20/20, right? You wish someone should have known about this, but
Right.
How well that's handled, and how much, I mean, the student has their own rights too at that point, and so it might be handled like a wayward teen needs a talking to kind of thing. So
but I guess what you're saying, it's telling how an administration would deal with this. So even at the high school level, is this at any level, should this be seen as a free speech issue, or that's not what this is when these flyers are handed out?
Well, I think it's less about that, and I'm actually more interested in the fact that it was happening at a high school by a student there. I think that's the interesting part to me as a watcher of patterns. That's the part that's more unusual. I think that the free speech stuff in high school tends to be more about, like, I'm wearing a edgy T-shirt, or not passing out American Nazi Party propaganda. Like, that's pretty heavy. So I think that's very interesting. It's not something that we would see a lot. Usually, that's more on college campuses, and it's done from the outside. So very interesting if it turns out to be the case.
All right,
I think it's definitely an outlier, something that I've seen.
We'll be checking it out. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, taking time on Sunday. Thank you.